All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Mandalay Bay C&D, where we're having the Cyber Insurance Summit this afternoon. Just a couple of reminders to please, if you haven't already, check out the Business Hall, which is also on this level. There's also the Black Hat Arsenal in the hall, and tonight is the Pony Award starting at 6:30. And I will not hold this up any longer. I bring to the stage Jeremiah Grossman to introduce our next speaker. Thanks, Jeremiah.
Thank you. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for hanging with us. Jeffrey Smith gave us a nice 101 talk on how to look at cyber insurance, some of the terminology, how it's positioned, how it's sold. The next speaker I'm really excited about. This is Jake Coons from Risk-Based Security. He is one of us. He's InfoSec. He has worked on the insurance side, and he's going to walk us through, now that you have a cyber insurance policy, how does that fit into the organization and what you can do to maximize both sides of it. So, Jake, take it away, man.
All right. How's everyone doing? We're good? All righty. So I am part 2 of this summit, which I'm pretty happy that is getting organized. And we're going to talk just about that, integration of cyber insurance into a risk management program. Now, before I begin, I'm sort of a unique guy, I guess, because I was a security guy, and then I went and worked in the cyber insurance world, and then I came back out, right? So I don't know if I went to the dark side or came to the dark side. It sort of gets a little confusing. But for those that sort of know me and are wondering who this guy is on stage, I typically look like that up there, right? All clean cut. But here recently, I decided to grow a beard and get some privacy and be anonymous again. And it works wonders. People walk by me, they don't know who the heck I am whatsoever. It's pretty hilarious. But I've spent a lot of time in the security space, tracking data breaches, understanding, trying to make better decisions from a security standpoint. And how I got into the whole insurance space was trying to help carriers understand how to make those better decisions and figure out what's going on, underwrite all those sorts of things. All right, before I get going, I do want to talk about the state of security from my standpoint just for a bit. And a lot of what we heard in the 101 session, there's going to be a little repetition here from a little bit of a different point of view. Not that it's a different sort of stance on it, but just you'll hear from sort of my take on things. But in the state of security, right, this is the data breach landscape, right? On the left-hand side here, we're looking at frequency, the number of data breaches that are occurring over time, right? And on the right-hand side, we're looking at severity. How bad is it? Because not all data breaches are the same. We know that, right? And so on the left-hand side, I think you can just see that, like, we're not seeing things get better, right? For all the vendors and all the shiny boxes and things that you can buy out there, we're not seeing it directly relate to a decrease of the number of data breaches that we're able to find, right? Not happening. And then the right-hand side, the severity chart is just, it looks ridiculous now because so many records are being lost. All those prior years there, they sort of look so small, right? But when you talk about 2018 and you go, what a great year, we only lost 5 billion records. We got better. Right? Something's not quite right. But I think when you think about this, we all know about certain data breaches that are out there and big ones that are happening, but there's a lot more that's going on that everyone's not sort of aware of. Now, for 2019, we just finished up a mid-year analysis looking at all the data breaches and what's happening for the year. And it's pretty startling, right? Because there's already been 3,800 new data breaches reported this year, right? And this is ending, for mid-year, so end of June. 4.1 billion records are already exposed. And when we looked at the comparison of this mid-year to last mid-year, things look horrible, right? The number of breaches are up, 54%? The number of records exposed up 52%. I do get tired of getting on stage and saying, we're on track for yet another worst year ever. But it's going to be the worst year ever for data breaches, at least in frequency side. It looks like it without a doubt, okay? So just we're not making the improvements, in the end results that we hope to on the security front. So with that said, let's be honest. Do we think it's only a matter of time for organizations? Do you sit there and, as embarrassing as it is as a security professional, say, it isn't if, it's a matter of when? Is it a ticking time bomb? Well, I think if you guys were all honest, you'd start to go, yeah, we're a little worried, right? We try to do everything that we can and it still has the potential to result in a data breach. And further, I don't want to get into any religious fights about how much the cost per record is. I have no desire to do that, right? There's lots of conversations about what it costs. But do we all agree that a data breach will cost you money? Is it going to cost you something? Yes, we know that's going to be the case, right? So here we are now. We have data that suggests that data breaches aren't getting better, frequency's up, things continue to go wrong, right? We all sort of feel, whether we want to admit it or not, that a data breach at our company or organization is quite likely, and we know it's going to cost us money, right? So with that in mind, let's start to think a little bit here about risk management and insurance, okay? Reality of risk. We have risk. We know this. This is what we're in the business of. We might not always talk about that in each of our security roles, right? We may say, oh, that's the risk team that does that, and we do other things. But we're all dealing with risk as security professionals, okay? In our training, we've talked about this forever. There are 4 things that you can do with risk, right? We hope to avoid risk. That makes the most sense, right? We don't want to, if we can avoid it, that's great. If not, we want to mitigate risk. We're going to do something. Controls, whatever it may be, whatever the next vendor solution is that's going to help us, right? We're going to do something to mitigate these risks. Now, there may be times when there's just a business reason that says that risk is okay and we're going to accept it, right? And you really hope that you're not in an organization where they don't care and they just sort of sign off exceptions and waivers and no one cares. We actually hope that there's legitimate reasons to accept risk, right? But there actually is this 4th thing called transfer of risk, right? Again, for all you that have studied security and certifications, we always have to say this, but as security professionals, we really haven't gotten our heads wrapped around it or as accepted it as maybe as we want. So when we think about what those transfer options are, there's a couple of them, right? So the first is outsourcing, right? So if we want to let someone else deal with it, we can do that, right? We can outsource risk and activities that maybe we're not best to handle, right? You see a lot of people doing that with payment card processing and other things of that nature. We can also transfer risk when it comes to contracts and agreements. We can write things in there that says, hey, you deal with this, right? It's possible. And then the one that we're here to spend the most time about today is obviously insurance, right? We can definitely transfer risk with insurance. That's part of the main, purpose of the whole thing. Now, I think you have to get your head wrapped around some of the basics of insurance before you jump into the cyber parts of it. I know I did when I was getting involved in it. So why the heck do people want to purchase insurance, right? And for a second, just step back and think about yourself. Don't think about all this cyber stuff for a second. So why do we do it? Well, yeah, we want to reduce some liability. That's probably a good thing, right, no matter what it is. We want to be able to recover losses if that's what happens or what we need to do. There may be some legal requirement, right, that says, hey, you need to have insurance or you can't do this. And that could be all sorts of things that happens, right? Sometimes they get a loan or an investment or things of that nature, you need insurance. But many times, insurance is just for like a peace of mind, right? You just want to feel better. You want to put your head on the pillow at night and say, yeah, if something goes wrong, I'm okay. I'm covered, right? Someone's there to help me out. So there's lots of reasons that motivate people to get any types of insurance. Now, the other thing you got to think about is insurance is typically purchased for your most valuable assets, right? If you have something that you don't really care about, are you going to go out and buy insurance for it? If you have a really nice car, right, you're probably going to get insurance. If you have some beater sitting out back, you probably say, I don't need insurance, right? So we're looking at this in terms of there's reasons driving insurance purchase, right? And then it's for our most valuable assets. There's lots of different types of insurance out there, tons of it. There's insurance to cover our people, right? There's insurance for buildings, property, things within the buildings. If you buy some expensive toys and yachts, you can insure them. If you do some, crazy activities and motorcycles, you can get all that sort of insurance. We of course know there's medical insurance, so there's always conversation about that. But then you start getting another insurance that sometimes maybe you don't know if you need it or not, but it definitely has a place in life, right? Who's gone into their local electronics store and you buy a new phone or a TV and you go to walk out and they say, hey, you want to buy that insurance coverage plan? And you have a moment of, do I? Right? Hopefully most of you don't, but I guess maybe if you think it's worthwhile and it's the right decision for you, you'll do it, right? But they even have insurance for travel. You're going to go out and do a big cruise and you're going to travel somewhere and maybe you pick the time during hurricane season and they say, hey, you want some insurance? You can get that, right? And it works. But they even have also insurance for like events. Think about, you're planning a big wedding and you want to make sure nothing goes wrong. You don't want it to rain on your big day. You can actually get insurance to cover that, and it will respond if something goes wrong in your event, right? All sorts of stuff is out there. And a lot of this stuff, you may chuckle about it, but this is pretty common stuff that people go, yeah, this makes sense, and I do this stuff. Ever traveled and hit a rental car place, and then when you go out, they say, hey, do you want the insurance? And again, you have another moment of, oh, good, do I need that insurance? Right? They even have insurance they call umbrella insurance because there's so many things that you might not even know about. We'll just try to cover all these other things. So there's a ton of insurance out there that is accepted and makes sense, and those insurance drivers and protecting your valuable assets for the reasons, right? But when we get to cyber insurance, people start to lose their mind, right? So right about now, I think half of you are with me and smiling, the other half's giving me really dirty looks because we're talking about cyber insurance. It's totally fine. But every time we start to bring up cyber insurance, people sort of they take a sit back in their seat a little bit, right? But do we believe that our systems and our data is the most important asset of our company? Yes? Okay. And all those reasons that we talked about, are they in play for your company? All those drivers? They are, right? So why do people hate cyber insurance? Also known as why have organizations not bought more cyber insurance, right? So when you try to think about this, what's the first one we think of? Do you guys believe that you have unbreakable security controls? Did anyone see the Oracle bus cruise in? No? Right? So no one's going to sit here and tell us that you think you have unbreakable security controls. Some people may think that the coverage won't last or it won't respond, right? It's sort of not a good policy. It probably won't be there for you. Some people may say it's not a good spend of budget. Some people have no clue that cyber insurance stuff even exists, right? It's not been something that's made its rounds in the security space as much as maybe it should have. Maybe there's other reasons, something else. But for the most part, after spending time on both sides, I'd argue that I think most organizations just sort of don't understand this cyber insurance thing. And that's one of the reasons there's some negative views to it. Now, when I made the decision to go from security into the insurance world, I took a lot of heat from all my friends, right? They called me the used car salesman. They said, Jake, what the hell are you doing to your career? You're blowing everything up. This is horrible. Why would you do that? And I get it, right? I mean, it comes across when you talk about insurance, there's sort of this general feel of, oh man, this isn't a good experience, right? And in some ways, an insurance sort of organization or the sort of the industry, they deserve this sort of bad reputation, right? I think every one of you can think of a personal time where you had an interaction with insurance and it didn't go the way you want to, right? And you weren't happy about it. Whether they didn't cover something you thought they should have, or they covered it but they were a pain to deal with and you had to fight all the time for it, or something along those lines, right? And for the same amount of those negative feelings, I think if you're truthful and you search back, you can think, hey, there were a few times where insurance was there for me, stepped in and helped me sort some things out, right? Just think in your personal life. And so I think that's the sort of same thing that's going on right now within the insurance world. But I will tell you what I see right now is anytime there's an issue with cyber insurance, whether it's a valid one or not, the media is jumping on the fact that this cyber insurance stuff is slimy, straight back to the used car salesman. This stuff's horrible, right? So, you don't have to search far to find out, I think there was a question earlier about the active war stuff, right? When Zurich said they weren't paying some things. And we look at another one and we talk about P.F. Chang's, right? And this was one where the cyber insurance actually did cover quite a few things, but they didn't cover some of the fines and penalties, right? So again, it comes out that, hey, lots of holes, beware. Another one, these are headlines, right? Bank loses 2.4 million. Insurance company says, how about 50 grand, right? Those are things that make you go, holy cow, this is bad news, right? This is super bad news. And then there's other ones that you'll see lawsuits and stuff where it seems like it's really bad and you start to realize they didn't even have a cyber policy. They were just trying to get coverage on another policy somewhere else, okay? So there have been some situations, don't get me wrong, where it feels a little slimy that an insurance company should have done something, but there's far, far more where these insurance companies are in fact paying, and they are in fact living up to what the insurance agreement looks like. Now, I do want to do a quick cyber liability insurance recap from my perspective. There are many names and many carriers out there, right? There are a ton of them. I do think now it is going to sort of be called cyber liability insurance. You know, a lot of the component of the insurance is liability, so you'll see that word thrown in there. It's being shortened enough to cyber insurance, but there's a whole other of these words that you could argue that are the same. Data privacy, internet policies, all these sorts of things. I've personally gotten over the fact of the cyber usage. I don't care anymore. I'm not going to fight the cyber term. It's cyber insurance. Let's just move on, okay? Now, what concerns me is that there are so many of them out there and they are so different, there's very little commonality. It is very, very hard to compare these things and to make sure you understand what's going on. Now, I have a ton of slides coming up in here where I'm going to tell you this over and over because it's a key point. Not all the policies are the same, okay? So just be aware of this when you're looking at sort of these things. You may find these different words. Now, a commercial sort of cyber insurance policy, it's got a lot of similarities to the things that you know of in your personal life, whether it's home or auto or stuff that you're used to doing, okay? But because it's this commercial policy, it's not the exact same as those homeowner things. So you got to understand the other similarities, but things are different that you need to be aware of, okay? Now, in the one-on-one session, we heard a little bit about first party and third party. This to me was the biggest thing that I got my head wrapped around. So I want to spend time from my perspective how I thought about this, okay? There's a third party, we crashed into someone and we caused the problem. First party, tree fell on our car and that was horrible, but it was damage to us, right? So try to think about that as we move forward, because we can get a cyber policy to cover both of those. We can get a cyber policy both of those, but you'll see some policies that come out and you think you have one and it's only covering maybe the liability aspect. Maybe it's only covering the third party aspects of it, okay? So we can get those protections to recover from an event. We can get those protections from the lawsuits, identify and start to get your head wrapped around, threat model, whatever you want to do to figure out what you think would matter for your organization. We talked about this in the one-on-one, but it's the same sort of thing, right? Most of these policies were set up really at a breach notice compliance standpoint, right? Something goes wrong, we think we have a data breach, so therefore we got to spend money on forensics and legal and mailing lists and credit monitoring and offering out free identity protection so we can say, oh, we're really sorry, please don't sue us, take this credit monitoring, right? All those sorts of things can be covered, okay? The liability aspect, in many cases, used to be the core of the policy, what a carrier would push, right? Responding to those regulatory problems, cost of reissuing credit cards if that's what the case is, settlements if you have to, a whole bunch of other things can be covered. Now, I just have here at the bottom, other first party. More and more of this stuff is coming up, right? So when you think about other impacts to your business, system restoration, getting you back up and running, if there's extra expense or extra cost to keep you running while an event's ongoing, extortion demands, ransomware, phishing, lost business, all these sorts of things can be covered. And in fact, these cyber policies are getting a little wild, right? Because the intent of the policy originally was to help with some sort of cyber incident, attack, a breach, whatever it may be. There are policies now that are expanding out into you just messed up at IT, right? System recovery stuff that we've talked about. So you went to do an upgrade and one of the team members didn't do a good job and it caused an outage. Some of these policies now will even respond to that. So we're seeing things get very, very broad. Not all cyber insurance policies are the same. They're not the same. I can't tell you the number of times that I've had someone come up to me and tell me something and I'll say, that's great, but it's not the same across everywhere, okay? Whether it's a carrier or an industry, et cetera. We need to understand this and stop broad brushing insurance when we talk about this stuff. Okay, as helpful as some of these policies can be, you should definitely expect that some things just are not going to be covered, okay? And in fact, reputation damage is one of the ones. When we talk about it all the time, you think a data breach happens, and you know, when it happens, then that company's in the news quite a bit. Maybe lots of jokes are made about them, and you know, damage to brand is a big one. Now, there are some services and things maybe help you from a PR standpoint and crisis and all those sorts of things, but you're probably not going to find a policy that says you go in and say, hey, our brand was damaged, give us some money, okay? So think about that. One that I had a really hard time getting my head wrapped around was regular maintenance, sort of upgrades and fixes. When you think about it, insurance is for a fact to get you back to where you were, right? You think in your personal life, if you're driving a nice Honda Civic and life is good and you get into a wreck, the insurance company doesn't come back and say, here's that new Ferrari for you, right? They're trying to get you back to where you were. So let's say your organization has an old, really, really old phone system, right? And there's a hack on that, there's some sort of breach, something goes wrong. The insurance company is going to try to get you back to where you were. They're not going to show up and be like, here's a nice new shiny voice over IP system that's state of the art. That's not what's going to happen, right? Now, they're not going to want to try to put you back to a situation where you're going to have another compromise, but it's a weird situation sometimes, and you just have to be mindful of that, okay? Insurance policy is not there to like maintain all this stuff for you. The economic value of data, right? A lot of times, folks will talk about confidential business plans or the secret formula for some, medicine or whatever it may be. Really hard to go and say, this is what this is worth, pay me money. Write me a check for this money, okay? Data or systems in care, custody, control of others, cloud or other your supply chain, while more and more policies are covering this, you got to be mindful of this. A lot of these policies are written in a way that say the named insured system, which means your stuff, right? They're underwriting and reviewing your organization and your systems. So if you decide, hey, I'm just going to let someone else have all these things and they'll deal with it, your policy may not respond to that the way that you want to. We've seen improvements in this space, but you got to be careful on it, okay? Now, here are some other not so common exclusions or ones that I tell you got to be really careful about, okay? Now, when you're in the insurance world, when you're trying to write a new product like cyber insurance and you don't have a good idea about what you're doing, you try to figure out how do you do this but not expose yourself so much, right? And so a lot of times carriers will cover something, but they'll put a small limit in there, right? So at the end of the day, they say, yeah, we cover ransomware. But if you look in the policy, maybe it's a small dollar amount, right? So you want to be careful. Not only do they cover it, but how much is covered, okay? Exclusions, they make sense at some point, right? There are certain things for a carrier that they just don't want to cover, and that's fine. But if you look at some of these ones up here, these are scary, okay? You really don't want these. Failure to encrypt data. We used to see this a lot. It's for the good carriers, they're moving away from this stuff, so you shouldn't see it. But there were a lot of times where you lost that laptop and it wasn't encrypted, no coverage. You didn't encrypt, right? That's not a good thing. The second one up there, failure to maintain or take reasonable steps to maintain security. That's a horrible one. You should run, right? We could make anyone look silly, right? Within 2 seconds. Oh, you didn't do that. You didn't do the right thing. That's a sort of we're not going to pay claims exclusion, okay? Now again, Not all policies have this, so for the love of God, don't walk out of here and go, I knew that stuff sucked, right? But these are things that you're going to want to look for. Widespread issues, widespread viruses, wormable things, we've seen that sort of been excluded. We've seen regulations and standards sort of rear their head. You're not compliant with PCI DSS, no coverage, right? That's not helpful. We've seen wireless come up. Oh, the unauthorized access started through a wireless network, not covered. Cloud, SaaS stuff, not covered, okay? Now, big business income loss is one that's getting a bit better. Not everyone cares about this or needs this, but if you're, let's say, an e-commerce organization and you're offline for a lot of time, there can be coverage that says, oh, we'll get you back up and running. Oh, and hey, and you were also facing a denial of service, and so we had to bring on, extra equipment and bandwidth and all these sorts of things, so we'll cover all that. But you're gonna tell me that you were down for 10 hours and you lost millions and millions of dollars in sales? Not covering that. But there are policies that will. They will. Now you gotta read the fine print too, because let's say you're down on Black Friday, and you could say, hey, I usually do $20 million there. There's some wording in there that'll say, we're gonna average it out over 2 months or 3 months, okay? But there is becoming coverage for these things because it's a need. The final one, and we've sort of dabbled around it, business interruption, or you'll hear the insurance industry call it, well, BI, right? It's an interesting one because the insurance carrier is there to get you back up and running, right? That's in their best interest. But there's this concept now called contingent BI. And it's something that scares carriers. And I'm sure Matt will talk about it, or maybe he'll avoid it, I'm not sure. But when you think about a carrier, they're not too upset about handling a couple claims that come in. That's something they're prepared for. They take good care in reserving money to pay claims. That's not a problem. But if all of a sudden Amazon goes down and thousands of claims come in, or the grid goes down on the East Coast and every one of their insureds there, something comes in, those are some mega events, right? I didn't want to put up the cyber hurricane picture. I saved you from that. But those systemic aggregation events are the ones that really, really scare them. And contingent BI is one of those things where if an internet provider goes down, if someone else goes down and has an interruption and impacts you, they may not want to cover, okay? Now, I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. Not all these cyber insurance policies are the same. You got to actually read this stuff. You got to read the policy. And if it's going to put you to sleep, just hire someone to read it for you, right? A good broker can help work with you to understand what you care about, what your organization faces, and tell you the good policies and cut through a lot of the noise. You don't need to go out there and read 500 to 700 insurance policies. I promise you that. Do not do that, right? You can cut through to the good ones, or you can get a broker or someone to help you find those right policies for you. But you got to read this stuff, right? You can't get mad that a claim wasn't paid when your organization didn't choose that coverage. They said, who would need ransomware coverage? We don't need that, right? Those are the things. Now, integrating cyber insurance, we've come to sort of some important parts here. From my standpoint, executives understand risk. They understand risk. They may not understand all the security nerd stuff we talk to them about, but they understand risk. They understand how to avoid, mitigate, accept, and transfer risk. Organizations are already transferring risk, okay? This is already happening. All that insurance we talked about in the beginning, this is already happening. Now, the part that needs to get a bit better is a lot of this stuff happens over in another organization. And again, depending on what size company you come from and where you are, things will be handled differently. But a lot of insurance purchases happen in the business side, the enterprise risk management side of the house, right? And so property, they're buying, casualty coverage for accidents, what's called EPLI, employee liability, workers' comp if people get hurt. And then again, we talk about that E&O insurance, that errors and omission. That's if your company says it's doing something and it doesn't do it quite right. I can guarantee you most of your companies, if not all of them, have this kind of insurance, okay? So we need to start talking with the executives about risk. From our standpoint, I feel like we're finally coming around from security folks that were saying that getting to perfect security, we sort of get that that's not going to happen. For a really long time, right, every security professional wanted to do everything possible and get us to this nirvana state of perfect security. And while that would be great, it sort of feels like we've gotten to the point now where we realize we can only take things so far. And if you go to work with a company to help them and they're just starting a security program, or you go into an organization, or you look at your own, even if they don't think they're doing security, they have some level of security in place, right? And then as you spend money, some of that initial money that you spend raises the bar pretty quickly. And then it gets to a point where like you can go out and spend millions and millions of dollars more, and it's only moving the needle so much further, right? So there's this diminishing returns of how many more things can we put in place. And so we, as professionals, right, security folks, we try to figure out where's that optimal space, right? Where's that, right spot to be? And you don't want to be too low, but you also don't want to be spending too much money that it's not really helping the organization. And this is where that transferring risk stuff comes in. This is where it's a key point. You can get your organization to a right spot, spending the right amount of money, and then for those other gaps where buying the next greatest security thing isn't working, you can start to look at transferring things. So for an exercise, just to get our heads around this, I'm sure a lot of you are from enterprises because we're out here at Black Hat, but let's just get our heads wrapped around this from a small business standpoint. Let's say that there's a small business out there, their yearly revenues are between $2 and $5 million, okay, for the sake of argument. If we started talking to them and said, what do you need to do for security? Where do we start? They need people, right? They need staff. Security people aren't cheap these days, so you need staff, hopefully more than one. You need software and hardware. And if I asked you, you can only pick one thing, could you pick one thing? No, right? We need antivirus and encryption and firewalls and DLP and you name it. We need a ton of stuff that we have to have, right? And then from there, hey, it's not enough that we're spending money internally to do this stuff. We need external validation. We need pen tests and bolt scans and legal and compliance and all these other things. So we're telling a small business that you got to do a lot of stuff, right? We're not saying, you can only do a couple things and you're good to go. We're telling them you have to do a lot of things. For the sake of the argument, and again, we're talking about just a small business here, 2 to 5 million in revenues, right? If they spent $200,000 a year on security, what's your initial reaction? And for this sake, let's say that all the big spends of buying all the software and hardware, that's already done. This is just sort of their yearly budget for security. Everyone starts to go, well, that's not enough. That's ridiculous. You need to spend a heck of a lot more. At what point, right? When you're talking about a smaller company, how much money do businesses need to spend on this stuff? I think we would all argue they should spend more. But if they spend more, does that guarantee they don't have a breach? I think at the beginning of our talk, we all agreed that that wouldn't guarantee anything, right? So this is when you start getting into the insurance stuff, and how can you think about this as part of a larger program, right? Because right now, the cost for insurance, it's ridiculously cheap. It's way too cheap. I've said this for a couple years now, and it's still cheap. There are so many carriers trying to get into this space that prices continue to push down from what I see. Now, we may be at a tipping point with certain types of coverages, right? But at the end of the day, costs are so low, it's just, it's eye-opening, right? When you can get $1 million in cyber insurance coverage for under $1,000, it's eye-opening, right? Now, pricing can change based on industry and your controls, don't get me wrong. So there'll be some of you that'll maybe go out and take a look, or you're giving me dirty looks saying, oh, it was way more when I got a quote, right? Yeah, it's totally true, totally possible. I would also argue that controls aren't as big of a factor as we all would love them to be. And in fact, there's a lot of carriers out there that do no underwriting. They will hate me to say this, but they'll look at your revenues, they'll look at your industry and say, here you go. And that's about it. Right? If I told you the number of security companies that thought they were going to get rich on insurance and used to come to me and say, I got a great idea. You know what? For every one of your applications that come in, I'll do a $15,000 pen test on them for you. Wouldn't that be great? Charging $1,000. Why would I spend more money? So there's definitely some math going on here that you need to think about, okay? But right now it is so cheap. It is unbelievable. And a lot of these smaller companies, when you talk to them about security, they're not out here at Black Hat. They're not spending all this time on it. They're confused by security, and they're not able to do a whole lot. Now, larger organizations, for many of you in the room, right? You can get insurance for a reasonable cost too, I believe. Okay? Now, just for sake of argument here, let's just say a large hospital, let's say they're $2 billion in revenues. okay? For that, let's say under $100,000 for $1 million in coverage. $5 million in coverage? Maybe under $200,000. Maybe less with the competition, who knows? But it's not a ton of money. It's not so crazy when you think about it in terms of what you're spending on other controls, okay? Now, what's also interesting is when you try to figure out how much limits you need, what you need, okay? There are some carriers that will stay low. They'll only write maybe $1 million, maybe they'll go up to $10 million and they'll stick around there. There's some other carriers that are willing to put out $100 million. They'll give you $100 million as what's called a primary insurance policy. I mean, they're the first ones that gives you that policy. Now, if you look at your organization and you start to do the math and you go, ooh, we got a lot of data, we got a lot of stuff. We need more than that. You can build these things called towers. You'll hear it called excess, where you go to one company, they give you $100 million, and then your broker or someone will say, hey, any other carriers? You want to put 100 on top? And they'll just add all this insurance on, and then you have this big tower of money. We've seen it $750 million, maybe more, but around that range. So you can get some really large towers. Now, of course, the larger you go, the more you're going to spend, but you can get these towers, okay? Pricing, again, changes on industry, changes on controls. What I have seen so far is risk management services that was covered earlier, where you can get all these, small businesses can get all these really cool things. Large organizations don't tend to like them. They don't tend to use them as much. So again, with all these policies, right, there'll be these free services that come along because a carrier doesn't want to lose $1 million for a breach. So they'll start to spend money to give companies free services. Small businesses love it. I can get $1 million in coverage for $1,000 and you're going to give me all these free services? My security guys over here tell me I got to spend more and more and more. So it's really interesting. Now, one of the key things for large enterprises that I like is that if you don't want to use the risk management services, that's okay, but you can start to use some of their vendors, as was discussed, and we'll talk about a bit more. Okay, have I said this before? Not all cyber insurance policies are the same? Nor are they priced the same. You need to shop around. Definitely shop around. Good broker is going to do that for you, right? They'll even go to some carriers and say, I don't know, that's a little high, what can you do? They can get you good rates at the right price and make sure you're getting the right policy. So in my view, there are definitely some limitations of these cyber insurance policies. But I find that there's real value in them. And depending on the industry and who you are, there can be some amazing value. Now, it's pretty funny when you go out to Google and you search about insurance. This one came up, which I thought was great, right? Who says insurance isn't fabulous? But I'll tell you that cyber insurance wasn't always as sexy as it is as now, and maybe it really even isn't. But I will tell you at Black Hat, it was definitely not accepted very well, because for quite some time I was trying to get cyber insurance in here. And I actually went back to all the reject letters that I got from the CFP board, and it was quite funny. So my very first reject from Black Hat was in 2011, and I was trying to talk about who pays when your data goes missing. In 2012, I thought maybe they're ready for it. Maybe they're now ready for it the next year. So 2012, rejected again. Took a little time off. I figured, okay, I'll give Black Hat a rest. Tried again in 2016, and in 2017, rejects, right? Now, one of the letters that I found, because I had all these emails for some reason, was one of the funniest things that I saw. In the reject comment, it says, I appreciate the need for this talk, but not at Black Hat, right? And so what I think's happening now is not just sort of looking at Google Trends about talking about cyber insurance and all that, but as Black Hat grows, as our profession continues to grow and mature, we're looking at all these things to do with risk, right? It's not just all offensive, technical things. There are some of these tools like cyber insurance that matter that we need to at least get our heads wrapped around. So I don't really care if you love insurance or you hate it. I could care less. I just want you to understand what it is and what's going on, okay? So here's some things that I want you to know. I believe firmly that if your organization doesn't already have insurance, it's going to, whether you like it or not. And a lot of that I'm seeing driven by regulatory contract stuff. Regulatory, or whether it's just contracts. Like if you're a company providing services to someone else, we're starting to see line items that just say, you need to have cyber insurance. Now, I will tell you, it doesn't say you need to have good cyber insurance, right? But it's saying that you need to have cyber insurance. So I think more and more of this is going to come to your organization whether you like it or not. From a responder standpoint, you need to be really, really careful. We'll talk some more about this. But from a security professional standpoint, I want people more engaged, okay? So help to fill out the application. I can tell you so many times, I have not seen IT or IT security specifically involved in the insurance acquisition process. If you're a really large enterprise, it's more likely, right, that you've been involved. But I've seen even cases where a broker will say, oh, don't worry about talking to your IT staff. I'll just fill it out for you. Don't worry, fill out the application. That's bad. You don't want that, okay? You want to be involved in that. As was mentioned before, you want to be honest about where you are control-wise. You don't need to exaggerate anything, just be honest where you are, okay? This helps to ensure you're getting the proper coverage, right? You want to make sure that you're filling it out right, you want to get the right coverage, and you need to know what it will cover. You need to know what's going to be covered so you can have these conversations. Final thing, there are a lot of requirements in an insurance policy is like an agreement. And there's things in there that says that you have to do. And if you don't follow these things, your coverage can be nullified, right? So if you don't play the rules like the way you're supposed to, there's a chance that they'll come back and say, hey, the claim's denied. And then you might get cranky about it, but they're going to say, but these were all the things that you were supposed to do. And you're going to say, well, I didn't know that because the business got the insurance. How do I know? Doesn't matter. You have to follow these things, okay? These aren't the IR processes, the incident response processes you're looking for. This is my 2016 reject talk, but I thought I got to throw this slide in, right? So from an incident response standpoint, this is the one that I want everyone to be really, really mindful of, okay? I think most companies have focused on creating and defining incident management teams and processes. It's been something that's been talked about for a while. I think we're making great steps, great progress in that space. So I'm happy about that. And some of you in the room have had the unfortunate opportunity to test out your IR processes, right? A breach, some sort of security event, incident, et cetera. But when it comes to cyber insurance, there are a lot of these processes that you have in place that you like, that you're used to, that may need to change. They may need to change if cyber insurance in there. And again, it depends on the carrier, depends on the policy and their requirements, but there's some things that you're used to from a security person that may change. As we talked about, the claims process is sort of like a normal insurance policy, right? So if there's an issue, you got to tell your insurance provider about it, right? Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. From there, you're going to get assigned an adjuster, a claims person, right? And in some carriers, I've seen old school carriers where they say, send an email and someone will get back to you. That's not so great. And we've seen others that have 800 numbers and better support for those things. But you need to know that there's a process that you have to notify them, and then you're going to get assigned someone. When you get assigned someone and they start to work the breach or the case, it can take several different paths, depending on what it is, right? I've seen situations where a laptop goes missing, and the carrier's like, okay, we'll start to work on that, but they're not gonna jump crazy and go immediately doing a ton of things. But if you tell them you're down or there's ransomware or those sorts of things, quicker responses can happen. So it just sort of depends. Now, all policies have this reporting requirement, and they'll call it timely reporting, okay? A lot of them will say, hey, within 30 days you need to tell us. Some will say within 60 days. There's some other ones that will say as soon as practicable, whatever that can mean. But they're basically saying, you got to tell us about this stuff, okay? Now, what's interesting is if you think about just in your personal life, if something happened to your home or apartment or wherever you live, and there's some damage going on, and you decide, yeah, I'll get around to tell the insurance person later, and you tell them like 6 months from now, and damage that could have been cleaned up for quickly and small has now gotten really expensive, you can understand why people want to know about. Same thing with carriers. They want to know about stuff as soon as possible. Now, if you don't notify them within this time frame, because again, it is sort of a contract, they could tell you, hey, you didn't report it in the time frame. No coverage. So you need to understand this. Now, the other thing that happens is there's a lot of concerns about what we'll call over-reporting. You know, in our industry, a lot of times, we're not entirely sure how bad it is, right? from an event to an incident to maybe a data breach, we don't really know. Something's happened and we're not really sure. From my standpoint, I think concerns about over-reporting are just a bit overblown. But if you are the kind of person that is reporting to your carrier like every little thing that happens, the carrier might say, what's going on over there, right? Something's bubbling over there. But in general, I think you want to err on the side of if you think you've had a breach, you think you've had an issue, you want to report it, you want to let them know. Now, cyber insurance can cover, policies can cover costs in typically two ways, okay? So it's called reimbursement or it's called pay on behalf. Pay on behalf is definitely much more common now. That's what I see for the most part. And a lot of I think it makes sense, right? Because what's happening is a carrier wants to pay this stuff off as cheap as possible, right? That's what they want to do. And you want that to happen as well, because if you're paying too much money, that may go over your limits. So this is good for both sides. But in order to do that, they actually go out and they get these agreements in place to try to get the lowest cost possible, okay? So they want to control things and they want to pay. Now the good news is, you're not going to have to deal with anything. The insurance carrier is going to pay all the vendors and everyone directly, so that's fine. But that means you can't pick your vendors, right? You're not going to be able to pick who you work with. So if you've got an amazing vendor that you've used for forensics or whatever it may be and you want to use them, there's going to be some policies where you won't be able to use them, right? Now the other way that you can cover costs is called reimbursement. And what I have seen at this point, there's only a few that are still doing this. But that's where you can pick your vendors, you pay directly with them, hey, go do this, and then you submit a reimbursement and you get paid. There's been a lot of cases that I have seen where a company goes and picks their, family, relatives, IT, generic company and says, hey, I had an issue, come help me. They're not security experts. They bring them in, they do forensics sort of half-ass, they pay, and then guess what? They didn't clean it up fully, and then things go sort of bad. So I'm seeing carriers that are sort of pulling away from letting, a company decide who they work with. If this is important to you, you need to understand this, okay? Now, panels. And I'm not talking about horrible panels on a station wagon or my picture of a death panel. What I'm really talking about is keeping those prices down, okay? They want to respond to a claim, they want to keep those prices down, and they're working with vendors to negotiate these rates. If you have a breach and you call up an IT firm or a security firm and say, hey, I just had a horrible problem, can you get here as soon as possible? Are you going to be able to negotiate the best rate at that point? No, you're just hoping they show up. Right? And costs can get out of control. So what carriers are doing is they're negotiating with these vendors ahead of time and saying, hey, if you want all of our business, I need your best rate and I need a really good rate. And then I'm going to give you all this business. And they're doing it from a legal counsel standpoint to get lawyer costs down, any security vendors, forensics, PR, all that sort of stuff. And we're seeing more and more of these proactive services, right? These things that you can get ahead of time. Now, a carrier is not going to recommend that you go use this exact security provider, because if they did and something went wrong, you could go back to them and say, well, you told me to use them and I got breached and it's your fault. So they'll try to negotiate and say, here are some things you could decide to do, but they're trying to get these better rates for you, okay? Now, I think this is a great thing because it can stretch that insurance dollar, right? So if you get a better rate, then you're going to be able to stretch it further. And I think it's a really good thing that we need to be mindful of. Now, if you have a vendor you really care about, you can ask a lot of these carriers or their brokers to say, who are the vendors you work with? And you can see ahead of time. So you can talk about that. Huge concern, just be careful about it. Risk management services and this concept of what's called by a lot of people a breach coach. Again, you can have a portal. They'll give this free portal where you can do assessments and all these sorts of things. They even may require you to submit your claim through that. So you need to be mindful of it, okay? They may require that you select a breach coach, and that's the first person that you talk to. Now, when I first started hearing this whole breach coach concept, it really annoyed me because it was a lawyer. And as a security person, I thought, if I have a problem, I want to talk to a security person about what we should do to resolve this. But a lot of lawyers are the first point of contact. And I've come around that it's not a bad idea because you get privilege. And so you can start to have conversations about this stuff under legal privilege, which isn't too bad. And then from there, understand what it looks like from a legal standpoint, bring those security vendors in that as you need. you just got to make sure you know the process before you need to use it. That's the biggest thing everyone needs to know. If there's a reporting process, you got to know what it is. So to me, with the rise of cyber insurance, it's clear responders, they need to know how this impacts them. I think for the most part, everyone's focused on quick response and getting things back up and running and all those sorts of things. The insurance policy can put a little wrench in the middle, right? Because you need to make sure that you're not doing things that aren't approved. So it's reporting. I still think it's trying to get things done quickly as possible, but you need to be careful before you just make decisions if you have an insurance policy in place. All right, let's talk about some actions. For what I want to get everyone to hear, continue to invest in security. For the love of God, I'm not saying stop doing security and just get insurance. That's not the message, okay? Now, what concerns me is that's what some people may hear. That's what some people may do. And we call this a moral hazard, right? So if you say, you know what, it's going to cost so much to invest in security, forget that. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just getting an insurance policy and I'm going to do nothing. That's bad for consumers. It's bad for everyone. We don't want that, okay? I hope what's going to happen is that carriers continue to raise their underwriting levels, where if you don't have basic security in place right now, you can't get insurance. But I see a lot of companies that have like no security at all getting insurance. So it's a very interesting time. You definitely want to define a plan in case of a data breach, without a doubt. You need to spend more time understanding your exposures. What are those sorts of data that you have, amount of records? What are those first and third party things that we talked about that could go wrong? So you can start thinking about the coverage. When you leave here and you get home and you recover and catch up on your emails, do me a favor, go find out if you have an insurance policy. Start asking the questions. Do we have one of those policies? And if you do, start to learn about it, right? Because what we've all talked about. If you don't have one or you can't figure it out, what I would advise you to do is just to ask the questions, right? Determine, review the coverage that might be important to you, as we've discussed many times. See if you can get a quote, right? Find a broker, talk to that arm of your organization that's doing insurance, see if they'll get a quote. If it makes sense and it's the right price, awesome, do it. If it doesn't, no big deal. For those that it will tell me, I did this 5 years ago and it was horrible, I get it. Try it again, right? Go check it out and see how it comes back around. I think in general, when I try to get my head wrapped around this, effective security programs cost a lot of money. There's just no way around it. We were sitting the other night and I was trying to ask people, if you could only do one thing in security at your company, what would it be? And everyone just sort of looked blankly because they want to list out all these things, right? So we're costing money for security, but we know they can still be compromised. Cyber liability is cheaper than most of the security controls, right? So while there are gotchas, there are legit players out there that have coverage and services, as we've talked about. So if you're in charge of security or a CISO and you have something that goes wrong, if you thought you were unbreakable and then it turns out that you weren't, what do you want to do? Do you want to say, whoops, sorry about that? I thought we had that under control. Or do you want to say, hey, we got a partner, we've got coverage, we've got a plan, and then file a claim and go from there. I still think it's a clear need for all organizations to have an incident response plan, don't get me wrong. Have it in place before you need to use it, et cetera. But what's really interesting about these cyber carriers, as they're maturing, they're handling a lot more claims, and they're paying more claims, okay? So it's not their first rodeo when that call comes in, we think we've been hacked, right? And for many of your organizations, hopefully you haven't had that call yet, or just a few. But the carriers are starting to see a lot of this stuff. So that response aspect, them being a partner, I think is really key, right? Those negotiated rates. Now, one of the things that I also like too, let's say you really need $100 million insurance, but it's just too expensive for you right now, and you get $1 million. I'd rather you get a smaller policy and have that partner, because after your insurance dollars are gone, you can then go ahead and still continue to use their services at the right rates. All right, I think that's it. There are a lot of people out there that could care less about security and responses, and they just want to know who you're going to call, and the insurance stuff gives you that. So I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to all that. I'll stick around for questions. I hope you guys enjoy the summit. Thanks, Jeremiah and Robert, for putting this together. I think it's great stuff. Okay.